In an interesting article by Russell Hunt entitled Hesiod a Satirist, a claim is being made that Hesiod's works and days is a clear example of irony, often gone unnoticed, or what Gregory Nagy regards as an archaic tradition of blame and praise poetry. Blame poetry typically creates a dichotomy of two persons who undergo some form of strife, characterized by what is known as an iron-alazon relationship. The iron would be the role played by the innocent or aggrieved party, in this case Hesiod, and the alazon would be the usurper, in this case his brother Perses, whose name, etymologically, is related to petho, portheo, and can be construed to mean to ravage, to waste, or to destroy. Many scholars interpret the works and days as illustrating Hesiod's moralism, and take at face value his pronouncements and criticisms of his brother's unjust and gluttonous behavior. Hunt, however, argues that Hesiod is using his brother Perses, who may or may not in fact be a historical figure, as a foil to demonstrate his own self-serving ends. The amusement evoked from the reader of the works and days comes about by Hesiod's tongue-in-cheek criticism of Perses. Both Hesiod and the reader are in the know, and it is Perses who is left outside the ruse. Hunt explains, quote, "The morality to which Hesiod would mold Perses's behavior is often counterfeit and patently self-serving. Adherence to the allegory of good strife will effectively prevent Perses from further depleting the poet's resources. Elsewhere, however, Hesiod's norm is for a richer man to buy up a poorer man's estate with impunity. We may question, then, the traditional assumption that Hesiod is a genuine moralist when he advocates the rustic values of hard work and simplicity, for the pretense of sincerity and moral earnestness is itself a convention of satire. An example of Hesiod's ironic tone is when he tells his brother to avoid gossip, while at the same time writing a work criticizing the failures and moral defects of Perses, a work which proved popular enough during his lifetime and has subsequently proven to outlast countless centuries. After all, we are still reading Hesiod's works. In another example, Hesiod gives his brother advice on seafaring. Quote, "At the poet's bidding, Perses must store his ship properly, observe the right seasons for sailing, and calculate what cargo to put on board for optimum profit." Right in the middle of his instructions, however, the poet reveals that he himself has had little experience in such matters. Only once, to sing in honor of Amphidamas, has Hesiod ventured to cross the wide sea. But as Hunt mentions later in the article, Hesiod's alleged hypocrisy is very much in keeping with what he records the Muses as saying in the opening to the Theogony. Quote, "We know how to say many false things similar to genuine ones, but we know, when we wish, how to proclaim true things." Hesiod, as poet, is preserving the prerogatives of the Muses. This is also perhaps an indication of the general nature of the works and days, which is specifically attuned to the messaging of the mortal realm. After all, according to the Theogony, and hence the perspective of the gods, there exists only one strife. But early on in the works and days, Hesiod modifies his earlier work from the perspective of the mortal position by clarifying to Perses that there are in fact two. Quote, "So there was not just one birth of strifes after all, but upon the earth there are two strifes. One of these a man would praise once he got to know it, but the other is blameworthy. And they have thoroughly opposed spirits, for the one fosters evil war and conflict, cruel one, no mortal loves that one, but it is by necessity that they honor the oppressive strife, by the plans of the immortals. But the other one, gloomy night bore first, and Cronus' high-throned son, who dwells in the ether, set it in the roots of the earth, and it is much better for men. It rouses even the helpless man to work." Hunt suggests that due to his playful irony and his evocation of blame poetry, Hesiod is depending on the duality of strife to convey his enigmatic messages. Hesiod is using his brother Perses and the kings as the embodiment and exemplar of bad strife. He calls his brother a mega nepios, a great idiot, and in doing so he likens him to the silver age of men, who were like children up until they died of old age. Quote, "Thereafter, in turn, a second race, much inferior, the silver one, the inhabitants of Olympus made, resembling the golden neither in appearance nor mind, But for 100 years a child was nursed by its mother, playing at home, a big baby. But when finally it grew up and reached adulthood, they lived but a short time full of grief because of their mindlessness. For they couldn't refrain from reckless violence against each other, nor were they willing to attend to the gods or to sacrifice on the holy altars of the gods, as is the proper rule for human beings according to their customs. To be a great baby can also be translated as a great idiot, to add some moral punch. As you can see, a great idiot is one who mindlessly engages in violence and is unwilling to sacrifice to the gods. This is a person who is engaged in hubris. The contrary form of strife, the good strife, is what is expressed by Hesiod towards his brother, which is akin to justice or dike, since sacrificing to the, quote, holy altar of the gods is proper for humans. However, Hesiod's criticisms and judgments are not limited to his brother. We also find that Hesiod is addressing the kings. Hesiod employs here a fable of the hawk and the nightingale, and Hunt sees the nightingale as Hesiod himself, with the hawk as the kings whose talons are crooked, just like their judgments. At the end of the fable, the hawk says to the nightingale, "Foolish is he who wishes to struggle against the stronger. He is deprived of victory and along with his shame also suffers." According to Hunt, we are seeing Hesiod describing in this fable an instance of how not to be in the world. And on the contrary, being in the world involves sacrificing to the gods, because it is there that we become kinsmen with the gods, through the establishment of, quote, the mutuality of being. We will elaborate on the necessity of sacrifice in the next video. Because the fable of the hawk and nightingale is referred to as an ainos, relating to the word aineo, which is to praise, and ainitomai, which is to speak in riddles, Gregory Nagy suggests that this ainos of the birds is meant for praising of the kings. But Hunt reminds us that the kings are only, quote, deserving of praise if they understand, phroneo, and presumably act on the message. Through bad strife, then, representing a form of hubris, good strife can come about. On a similar level, Hesiod's good strife arises due to the bad strife of his brother, Perses. Therefore, there is independence between these two strifes. It is interesting to note the silence of both Perses and the kings. We are not presented here with a dialogue, and in fact, if this was indeed wisdom literature, we would traditionally be presented with a dialogue between teacher and pupil, sage and king, father and son, or in some Near Eastern cases, the transference of knowledge from father to daughter. But as Clay notes, quote, ultimately, Hesiod's dramatic monologue is aimed beyond Perses and the kings at us, his audience, both as recipients and as witnesses. This is a satire to which we're allowed to react. The role Hesiod is enacting, that of the iron or aggrieved moralist, also typically expresses a certain traditional or provincial ethic, something perhaps akin to a hard-working, humble, ascetic farmer. Hesiod says, quote, "Fools, nor do they know how much better the half is than the whole, or how much good there is in living off mallow and asphodel." Again, Hesiod is being ironic. However, even though Russell Hunt is absolutely correct in his perceiving a satirical tone to the works and days, it is important to note the multifaceted workings of Hesiod, for there is no doubt that the Theogony and the works and days are complementary works, and although there exists a tension between them, the texts are in constant communication. Hunt sees Hesiod as assuming the role of an iron in this satire, which allows him to assume the guise of a country bumpkin or a rustic simpleton. Hunt sees in the previous lines that the role of the, quote, iron adopts the rustic's manner to serve his own ends, to seem a straightforward moralizer when he is in fact a sophisticated manipulator of others. Of course, traditional moralizing may be sincere. It is at least potentially ironic, however, and becomes ironic when it is undercut by self-serving ends or hypocrisy. The good that Hesiod expresses in, quote, living off mallow and asphodel is of course ironical. After all, a book on garden lore explains that, quote, the asphodel was planted on graves because Homer had associated it with the underworld. Quote, past the gates of the sun and the home of dreams they went, and came swiftly to the fields of asphodel. The commonest asphodel in Greece is the microcarpus, with pinkish-gray flowers. Its regal spears suggested to poets the regiments of ghosts marching on the shores of Acheron. Also, the mallow was similarly understood to be planted on graves in the belief that the dead could eat from, quote, such perfect plants. However, no human being could possibly survive for very long on a fare fit only for the dead, suggesting perhaps that as ephemeral beings, compared to the gods, we are indeed closer to death. In the earlier portion of the sentence, the notion of the half being better than the whole seems to reverse an echo of a sacrificial scene in the Odyssey, specifically where Odysseus' servant Eumaeus sacrifices in honor of his disguised master. Eumaeus sacrifices a boar and divides it into 7 parts. One of the parts he dedicates to Hermes and the nymphs, and because Odysseus in disguise is a stranger, a xenos, he is also being treated with the respect worthy of a god. Since in an earlier video we mentioned that Zeus Xenios is in fact a patron of the foreigner or the stranger. For this reason there is an underlying divine property or aura to the Xenos. Therefore, because of his elevated position, Odysseus is honored with a share called the unbroken back, the noton dienekes. Olaf Almqvist suggests that this, quote, unbroken portion signifies totality, in line with the preoccupation in sacrifice between the whole and the part. What Hesiod is ironically declaring is his insistence on the superiority of part or the division to the whole. Odysseus is a hero or a superior soul, and it is not for mere mortals like Perses or you and I to claim that privileged whole piece. This, of course, does not bar us from feasting with the gods, as we'll explore in the next video. In another line, Hesiod says, quote, once already we proportioned, diomai, our share, kleros, but you, seizing much extra, carried off the greater part, flattering gift-eating kings, who see fit to render this justice. Effectively, the act of sacrifice, the cutting and dividing and the apportionment of its parts, establishes a hierarchy of relations between the realms of the divine and the realms of mortals. Hesiod believes in the ontological distinction between gods and men, and nothing could separate their two realms more than the physical expression of the two works, the Theogony dealing with the emergent relations among the gods, and the works and days focus in the realm of history, with the progression of the races of man, farming techniques, and the cycle of years and days. As Jennifer Clay concludes, quote, thus, the orientation of the two poems suggests the existence of irresolvable tensions between the divine and the human cosmos. Elsewhere, she states that the Theogony and the works and days must be interpreted together, each complementing the other, in order to form a unified whole embracing the divine and human cosmos. However, even though there is a distinction in terms of the ontology of gods and humans, Hesiod indicates that there is a manner in which they interact and form bonds and relations. Referring to the earlier fable of the falcon and the nightingale, we can see that Hesiod differentiates between the world of the animal kingdom and that of man with respect to the gods. Quote, fish and beasts and birds of the air may feed on one another, since they have no justice. To men, Zeus gave justice, which by far is the best thing they have. In this sense, if the absence of justice in the realm of the animal world is characterized by each feeding, quote, on one another, then the expression of justice entails a feasting together with humans and the gods. What the titan Prometheus does in Mekone is to distance the once close relationship between the gods in the realm of Kronos, where men and gods dine together at the same table as near equals, like the Ethiopians or the Phaeacians, in a realm of ambiguity and uncertainty characteristic of Kronos' reign, to a relationship of distance and further differentiation of humans from gods, marked by a hierarchy. The hierarchy that looks both ways in its establishment of relations, although unequal and set apart, establishing connection. In summary, we can see that Hesiod is employing irony and satire in portions of the works and days. But rather than merely employing these devices for the sake of self-serving interests, as Hunt would contend, it is important to first remember that the works and days is being written in the context of the mortal realm, where things are never as they appear, and where good is mixed with evil, and ambiguity, even of poets, can call into question when one is being humorous and when one is being serious, or perhaps even both at the same time, as suggested by the word spudogailoion, the mixture of jest and seriousness which is a hallmark of the satirist. The ainos of the nightingale and the hawk is suggestive of an enigma, that must be interpreted correctly and acted upon. But we must reorient ourselves from the amoral nature of the animal kingdom from which this tale emerges, towards a more just orientation towards the feast of the gods. It is to this that Hesiod alludes, the bridge through the intersection of the myths of Prometheus in the Theogony and the works and days. Take care for now.